Thanks, Alyssa. I appreciate it. Good morning, everyone. I am Leah Forney. I am the Underserved Populations Policy Advocate Training Assistant here at the Maryland Coalition Against Sexual Assault. So I will be before you guys for the next hour teaching on serving sexual assault survivors from underserved populations. So just a quick overview of what we'll be discussing today. We'll talk a little bit about underserved populations and we'll focus on identity, oppression, and trauma. We'll also do a little discussion around barriers to access. So we'll talk a little bit about what prevents people from accessing help or accepting help. And then we'll wrap up the conversation on moving forward. So we'll talk a little bit about socio-ecological model as well as equity. So underserved populations, who is underserved and why? So when we hear the term underserved populations, I want to talk a little bit about what does that actually mean, right? So we know that all sexual assault survivors are underserved, right? We also know that sexual violence is 100% preventable, yet it still is happening every single day, right? People of all identities, all backgrounds have fallen victim to being sexual violence and sexual assault. And so all sexual abuse survivors experience barriers when it comes to justice and the healing that they deserve. And so today we're going to talk about the survivors who may face additional barriers and trauma solely because of their intersecting identities. These survivors not may be underserved by our organizations because of our cultural attitudes, our beliefs about their identity, and our individual lack of awareness and understanding of their identity and systematic oppression of the people who hold that identity. And so that is who we're talking about when we're talking about underserved populations. So to kick off the conversation, I want to talk a little bit about identity. And so note that this is not a exhaustive list, nor is it in any order. When we talk about identity, we talk about a few different groups. And so the first group is age, right? And so age is one aspect of our identity, right? When we talk about young versus old, right? Age focuses on the cultural views and how we treat people according to their age, right? So some examples you might see in like Asian cultures. In Asian cultures, getting old is seen as something positive, right? And so the people in Asian cultures, they treat their elderly with much respect and they are cared for by their children. In other cultures, age or getting older might not be seen as something positive. The second identity is race. So race is a socially constructed category, right? So this is when we're looking at things based on skin color. So black, brown, white, mixed race, biracial, multiracial. That's an identity as well. The third category is ethnicity. So ethnicity is when we're looking at culturally shared heritage, right? So that's when we get into things like Latinx or Afro-Caribbean or Pacific Islander, right? The thing to note about ethnicity is that it's not necessarily tied to race and it's not necessarily tied to geography. This is where we focus mainly on culture. The fourth one is national origin. So when we're looking at national origin, we're really looking at where was this person born, right? So we're looking at the geographical location. So this is when we get into things like Australian, Germany, Japanese, right? We're looking at where was this person actually born. Then we have skin color. And so skin color, similar to race, it looks at the different shades of one's skin, right? So light skin, dark skin, brown, right? Oftentimes skin color is intersected with race. right? So someone can be Black and light skinned, or someone can be Black and dark skinned, right? And so we're looking at shades of color when we look at skin color for an identity. Then we have disability. So disability can be a few things. It could be mental illness, it could be physical disability, it could be a cognitive disability, right? And so disability as an identity kind of has expanded over the years. For a long time, disability was only seen as something physical, and now we're seeing that disability is more than just a physical handicap. It can be, again, mental illness, cognitive issues. Another identity that one could be using is deaf or hard of hearing. So these are usually individuals who, again, are experiencing some other form of disability as it pertains to their hearing. Some of them identify this as a disability, others do not. Then we have faith, religion, and spirituality as an identity. So again, we're looking at things like Christian or Catholic, for an example. We have gender identity and expression. So this is looking at how one identifies when it comes to their gender. So we're looking at things like man, woman, cisgender, transgender, gender non-conforming, non-binary as some examples. Then we're looking at an identity of sexual and romantic orientation. So this is defined by the gender or genders of the person who they deem sexually attracted or romantically attracted. So we're looking at things like lesbian, bisexual, gay, asexual, biromantic, queer, just to name a few. Socioeconomic status and class. So this is when we're looking at things like high class, middle class, low class, privilege as a part of their identity. Tribal or indigenous affiliation is another identity. First language is another identity. And this is basically the language that someone learns to speak first, right? So whether they're English speaking or Spanish speaking, that's what we're looking at. Immigration status. So are they a citizen? Are they temporary or permanent resident? Are they undocumented? Are they a refugee? So that's what we're looking at. And then the last identity that we are looking at is body size or type. So it's important to note this identity because weight discrimination is important, right? And that's why we included it as a type of identity, because we do see that it's oftentimes ignored as a type of prejudice against individuals. So now let's talk a little bit about intersectionality. And so the thing that I want you to know about intersectionality is that no one group is the same because no one person holds just one identity, right? So some of you all may have already been familiar with the term intersectionality, but if not, Kimberly Crenshaw, who was a lawyer and professor at UCLA School of Law and Columbia Law School, coined the term intersectionality in 1989 to describe the intersection between identities and power. For example, she discusses how a Black man can experience discrimination because he's Black, and a white woman can experience discrimination because she's a woman, right? However, a Black woman can experience a different type of discrimination because she's both a woman and Black. And so the way of her intersecting identities often leads to how she is treated in various different life experiences. So the other thing that I want you to know about intersectionality is that we also know that there are populations that are underserved, not because of identity, but because of circumstances as well, right? So for example, a homeless person can be underserved. Someone who's incarcerated can be underserved when it comes to sexual violence. And so statistically, folks with marginalized identities are more likely to be filtered into these circumstances. So it's important that when we're having a conversation around how do we best address or service underserved populations, that we center our conversation around identity as a part of the framework as well. So to quickly recap intersectionality, someone from an underserved population is someone who holds one or many identities that have been historically and or currently oppressed. So now let's talk a little bit about oppression. And what do we mean by been oppressed, right? Like, what is oppression? And so, one of the best definitions for oppression is a perpetual state of disadvantage, right? So, this means that a person can be experiencing something and they cannot pull themselves up by their bootstraps to get out of it, right? So, oppression is historic, it's systematic, it's ingrained in our cultural beliefs, our attitudes, and behaviors, right? And it is often traumatic for those who are experiencing it, right? And so we'll talk a little bit about trauma as we go along. But one thing I want you to know is that one of the most important connections to make here is that oppression operates via a system of power, right? So people who hold one or many dominant identities are given unearned power in society. And people who hold one or more marginalized identities are rendered powerless. This is how hierarchies work. One group has power and the other group is rendered powerless, right? So again, when we're talking about anti-sexual violence work, it's important that we discuss oppression and we discuss how power operates in the same way in sexual violence as it does with oppression. Remember that when one is victimized by sexual violence, their power is taken away from them, while the person who harmed them, right, their perpetrator, now has power over them, right? So sexual violence is a power-based attack, just as racism is, sexism is, anti-LGBTQIA, ableism, all of those are power-based violence. And so this violence is used to perpetuate oppression of a targeted group. The other thing I want you to know is that we know that any one of the identities that we just discussed can be victimized by sexual violence. But we also know that folks who already hold marginalized identities are deemed powerless by society, are at a higher risk of being targeted, right? So, for example, people with mental illness are more likely to be targeted when it comes to sexual violence. People who are transgender are more likely to be targeted when it comes to sexual violence. People who are homeless are more likely to be targeted when it comes to sexual violence. Indigenous people, children, right? All of them experience extremely high rates of sexual violence. And again, this is why in the work that we do, we have to advocate for anti-oppression in the sexual violence work that we do. The last thing I want you to know is that to get to the root of sexual violence, we have to advocate for equal and equitable society where power is shared. Part of that journey is eliminating our personal biases. It's expanding our personal and professional networks. It's improving access to our institutions for marginalized people, and it's enhancing support of marginalized people within our institutions. So now let's talk a little bit about the four elements of oppression, right? And so there are four elements that make up oppression. We have defined norms, we have institutional power, violence and threat of violence, and then economic power. So in defining the norms, what we typically look at when it comes to oppression is race, gender identity, class, age, religion, sexual orientation, right? And those same defined norms then spill over into our institutions, right? So when we look into our healthcare institutions, right, how is healthcare treating those of a certain race or a certain gender identity? When we look at our military, How does the military use their power when it comes to certain races, certain classes, certain sexual orientation? When we look at our legal system, right, how are they using their power against certain ages or certain gender identity or certain sexual orientation? The same with our law enforcement, right? How are they using their power when it comes to race and gender identity? Political representation, right? Do we see more people that look like the communities they say they serve, right? So if you have someone that's running for office and they say that they serve communities of color, does this political person represent communities of color? And then our educational system, how is the institution using their power when it comes to race and gender identity and age? That same power spills over into violence and threat of violence, right? So again, keep in mind, oppression is all about power. It is a power-based violence, right? And so we're looking at physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal abuse, intimidation, harassment, right? Institutional and on an individual level, right? So violence and threats of violence can come from one individual, or it can be something that's embedded in the institutional system, right? So, for example, the prison system can be an example of institutional violence, right? Because it perpetuates oppression throughout that system. And then the last element is economic power. So, how are all these roles playing in employment opportunities, our ability to get credit, right? Lending practices, college courses, right? We just had a situation with, was it Navy Federal, where people were starting to look into their lending practices and seeing that, hey, they're operating in a place of oppression because they found that a percentage of African American or people of color were being denied mortgage loans, right? All of that is oppression. And so, again, as we want to do anti sexual violence work, we have to keep in mind that oppression plays a role in these underserved populations. So now I want to hear from you. And so in the chat, I want you guys to share with me what are some forms of oppression that you've seen in your line of work? Ooh, ageism. That's a big one. Sexism. Yep. Any others? Mental oppression, racism. Yep. Sexism. A lot of sexism is coming up. Economic status. Socioeconomics. Yep. Racism, especially towards individuals from a big city. Yeah. Yep. Economic status. Yeah. Awesome. And so language barriers, that's a big one. Cultural. Yep. All of these are forms of oppression. All of them. And again, they play a role in not only the work that we do, but who we serve. And so I want you all to keep these things in mind as we continue to go throughout this training, right? Transphobia, that's a big one. Immigration status. And all of those forms of oppression also play a role in how people accept, right, or access services, which we're going to talk about in a few. So now let's talk about the rape culture pyramid. And so this pyramid was actually designed by the Virginia Sexual Assault and Domestic Violence Action Alliance. I believe that it is literally one of the most wonderfully done visual representations of the way in which oppression is founded in sexual violence, right? And so, oh, sorry, y'all. So the structure forms of oppression cultivate a society in which attitudes, behaviors, and policies higher up on the pyramid become prevalent and pervasive. So if you look at the bottom, right, the bottom is the forming blocks to what is creating additional harmful behaviors and attitudes towards the marginalized, right? And so if you look at the bottom, we're looking at the attitudes of, like some of you all mentioned, homophobia, transphobia, racism, sexism, ableism, classism, right? All of those things kind of laid the foundation of how rape culture begins to exist. And so when it comes to sexual violence, right, prevention cannot be successful without addressing structural oppression. And we also have to consider the roots of structural oppression in our work when we're doing direct services with survivors and navigating systems to support them, right? So, as we all just talked about some of the oppression you all have faced in your own line of work, this is how rape culture continues to exist because it starts there. It starts at the structure. It starts at the foundation, right? And then it builds. So that same homophobia and racism and sexism and ableism then turns into victim blaming, right? Then it turns into slut shaming and rape jokes. Then it turns into privilege, right? Then it turns into how we begin to rigid our gender roles when we start to say things like, oh, boys will be boys, right? And then it goes further up to now we're catcalling and we're talking and following people, we're flashing people, right? And then it goes further up to now we're groping and there's sexting and nudes to now from there it goes into drugs and rape. And so if we don't address the structural oppression, if we don't address the fact that we have racism and sexism and ableism, it almost becomes like a domino effect. It just gets worse and worse and worse. And that's how rape culture begins to exist. So now let's talk a little bit about trauma, right? So what is trauma, right? The one thing that I want you to understand is that trauma is a normal response to an abnormal experience, okay? So how a client or a patient responds to a traumatic abnormal experience is absolutely normal. And so every survivor that we encounter reacts to trauma in their own way. And so some signs that you might see when someone is reacting to trauma is flashbacks, triggers, other symptoms of PTSD, substance abuse, depression, anxiety, numbness or disassociation, avoidance, hyperarousal, impacted sense of identity, eating disorders, sleep disorders, self-harm, suicidal ideations, or attempts. And again, that's not an exhaustive list. That's just some of the things that we typically see. The other thing I want you to know is that there are several types of trauma. But for this presentation, we're going to focus on four main ones. And that is collective trauma, historical trauma, cultural trauma, and structurally induced trauma. And as we discuss these things, you might notice that some of them intersect with each other. So collective trauma. Collective trauma is trauma that impacts individuals and groups. So some examples might be colonization, gender-based violence, institutional racism, police brutality, and most recently the COVID-19 pandemic, right? That was a collective trauma. Everybody went through COVID, whether they had experienced COVID for themselves or they know someone that they experienced it, but just everything that happened in society, we all experienced it together, right? And so that's a collective trauma. Historical trauma is cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations, right? So some examples of historical trauma would be genocide or apartheid or slavery or environmental degradation, right? Some of those are some examples of historical trauma because it's trauma that expanded over a lifespan and across generations. The other trauma that's not mentioned that's also a part of historical trauma is transgenerational trauma. And so studies have found that trauma can be inherited, right? Trauma can be literally transferred from one generation after another, right? And so typically with transgenerational trauma, we get into things like complex post-traumatic stress disorders and anxiety, right? So an example of transgenerational trauma can be people who descended from Holocaust survivors, right, have been found that they now have elevated heart rates, right? And so transgenerational trauma is typically connected to historical trauma. Then we have cultural trauma. So cultural trauma can occur when attempts are made to eradicate a part or all of a culture of people, right? So another example of that is Holocaust, right? Holocaust was a cultural trauma because its goal was to try to eradicate a whole group of people, right? Um, Treatment of indigenous people, that can be another example of trauma. Genocide, right, can be another example of cultural trauma. White supremacy is another example of cultural trauma. The thing that you want to know about cultural trauma is that cultural practices that create dignity violations or harm to others in their culture, right? So we have cultural practices like female genital mutilation, toxic masculinity, right? Secrecy within the family and within the church. All of that is forms of cultural trauma. And then the last type of trauma I want to touch on is structurally induced trauma. And so structurally induced trauma is trauma created by the policies that result in unjust, abusive, racist, homophobic, or unsafe systems that cause hardship, often on a long-term continuous basis, right? So an example of structurally induced trauma can be our prison system, or the prison to pipeline policy. It can be border control, capitalism, right? All of those things are different policies that are in place that cause long-term effects, right? Again, classism, our public school system, all of these are examples of structurally induced trauma. Now, the last thing I want you to know is that these traumas are important to keep in mind because when an individual survives a sexual assault, they may be dealing with trauma after that event, right? However, if there are a marginalized identity, they already are living with cultural trauma or transgenerational trauma, right? And this is very important when we start to talk about how we address some of those barriers, right? Because if you're working, say, for an example, with an indigenous survivor, they're coming in with their current trauma of being sexually assaulted, but they're also bringing cultural trauma with them. They're also bringing transgenerational trauma with them, right? And so that compound trauma is literally going to impact their ability to seek help, to navigate support system services, and their ability to heal from what has happened to them. And so this is going to be important as you continue to do the work that you do. All right, so now we're going to talk about some potential barriers to accessing services. Again, no one person has the same response when it comes to sexual violence and trauma. Everyone's experience with abuse is going to be different. Therefore, their trauma response is going to be different, and how they move throughout the world is going to be different, right? But there are many barriers that may prevent someone with a marginalized identity from seeking help after an assault, as well as barriers that after reporting may prohibit them from having their experience validated and addressed as effectively as possible. A lot of those barriers are ones that we all know and have heard and maybe even experienced, such as victim blaming or shame or embarrassment, right? And so keep these things in mind as you are working with survivors, especially those in underserved populations, because Those are some of the barriers that are going to prevent them from getting the healing that they deserve. So I want to hear from you all again. Okay. So in the chat, let me know what are some barriers that may prevent a survivor with a marginalized identity from seeking services? Leadership. Yeah, it's good. Lack of comms tech, transportation, trust. Yep. Funds, lack of care. Yep. These are all good. Any others? Understanding, fear, shame. Yep. Fear of immigration status, retaliation. Absolutely. Awesome. Those are all good ones. Oh, one more. Embarrassment. Yeah, absolutely. So now let's talk about it. So we're going to talk about two types of barriers. We're going to talk about barriers to accessing services and then barriers to accepting services because they're two sets of barriers, right? So when it comes to working with survivors in marginalized communities, right, with marginalized identities, they oftentimes face barriers to accessing services. And so when we're talking about barriers to accessing services, what we're talking about is how do we get them through our doors, right? How do we get them to at least show up and begin the process of getting help, right? And so there's two ways to look at that. We got to look at it from the response from their community and then also the response that they may get when working with advocates. And so when working, the response they get from their community is, for example, if you're working with someone who may be for Black and yet transgender, right? There may be this fear of coming out or being outed. And so if they want to get help, but they're afraid to go and show up for the services, oftentimes there's this fear there, right? And so we want to keep that in mind when we are working with the communities that we work with, because a lot of times what stops them from crossing over into our doorsteps is an actual fear. Are they going to be outed? Is someone going to find out that they're coming to seek services? Are people going to find out if they've never shared that they are transgender or if they never shared that they're LGBTQIA? Is somebody going to find out, right? So that fear of coming out or being outed is a barrier. The other barrier that they might get when it comes to their community is this fear of not being believed, right? We see this a lot, especially in communities of color, right? Where it's, if I tell someone that I was sexually assaulted, are they going to believe me, right? Oftentimes that's a real fear, right? And so we have to keep that in mind as well when we are working with survivors, right? That they might not open up right away because they don't think that you're going to believe them. Another barrier that they might face when it comes to accessing services is the relationship with the offender, right? We saw this during COVID, right? A lot of people who were in abusive relationships unfortunately ended up having to be at home with their abuser, right? And so, in situations like that, where someone is dependent upon the offender, that can be a barrier as to why they won't walk through your doors, right? Because what's going to happen if they now are no longer connected to this person, or they have to leave this person and this person is the sole breadwinner? That's a real fear, right? And so that could be a huge barrier as to why someone is not going to walk through the doors. And then another fear is what happens after they report. So if they find the courage to actually report that they were sexually assaulted, right? What's going to happen, right? Who's going to find out? All four of those things are real barriers that oftentimes keep people from walking through our doors, right? The other piece is when working with advocates, right? Sometimes what keeps people from accessing services is this fear of how they're going to be perceived, right? Not just by their community, but by the person that is assigned to work with them. This is why it's going to be so important that we check our own personal biases, right? Our own preconceived notions about people, about a race, about a community, about a culture, because these are things that go through someone's mind prior to walking into your doors. Is how am I going to be perceived? If I have a gender expression of they, but to the person that is working with me, they see a female, right? Are they going to respect that? Or are they going to be like, oh, that's a she, even though I don't identify as that? That's a real fear. The other fear that a lot of people have when it comes to accessing services is fear of other forms of violence from the state, fear of the police, right? We see that a lot, especially in communities of color, indigenous communities, BIPOC communities, right? There's a real fear of law enforcement, right? And so that can be a barrier to prevent someone from accessing services, right? Another barrier that can prevent someone from accessing services is fear that the service provider will not understand or affirm their identities, right? Again, that is a real fear. Just because I might look like a female to someone does not necessarily mean I identify as one, right? And so you want to keep that in mind when you are working with survivors in your line of work, right? Because those are some of the barriers that are going to keep them from walking through your doors. So now let's talk about barriers to accepting services, right? So remember, accessing services is getting them to come through your doors, right? Accepting services is now that they have came through your door, how are you going to get them to stay, right? How are you going to get them to actually get the help that they say they need, right? And so again, we're going to look at it from a community standpoint and working with advocate standpoint. So from a community standpoint, some of the barriers that will keep them from actually getting the help that they need and accepting your services is stigma and shame around what has happened to them. So if they walk into a service provider where they have a culture of victim blaming, right, or shaming someone, that's going to send them right out the door. Why would they stay? So you got to keep that in mind. The other thing is that they have a distrust in the legal system. And this is important, especially when we're working in communities like indigenous communities, BIPOC communities, communities of color, right? They already don't trust the legal system. So if I'm coming to you for help and the first thing you want to do is call the cops, what's the likelihood that I'm going to stay? Right? You got to keep that in mind. They're coming in with that, right? Other cultural barriers like secrecy in the household. This is very common in communities of color, right? When you've grown up in a community environment that says stuff like what happens in this house stays in this house. So you're sworn to secrecy. Well, if you're being violated or victimized by someone in your household and you come into a service provider, they have to be able to understand that. They have to understand these cultural barriers that might keep me from fully accepting services, right? We see this a lot, especially with our young people, right? Especially young people who might be from a marginalized identity, like a person of color, and they're in the LGBTQIA. We see this a lot because they might be having health insurance still connected to their parents, right? And so if mom and dad don't know that they identify as an LGBTQIA, right? And they're using their medical insurance, who finds out? We got to keep that in mind. Historical trauma, right? We've talked about this, right? A lot of times, the communities we serve are not only coming in with the trauma of being sexually violated, but they're coming in with cultural trauma. They're coming in with historical trauma, right? This is especially in people with people of color, because we know historically people of color have been experimented on. That is a true barrier. I don't know if I can trust that you're going to give me the help, right? You got to keep that in mind. Gender and sexual orientation stigma. Again, are you going to be the type of service provider that affirms their identity? Or are you going to be the type that continues to perpetuate the stigmas that there's only two types of identities, you're either a man or a female, right? And then inadequate healthcare systems, right? That's a big barrier because if I can't get the help that I need from the hospital that lives nearby, that I live near, right? Because they don't have the proper healthcare system set up or they don't have the services I need. And now I have to travel all the way across town to get help. That's a barrier. I might not go and get help because I don't have the funds. Somebody mentioned that in the chat. I don't have the funds. I don't have the transportation to get where I need to go. So we have to think about these things. Another set of barriers is when working with us as advocates, right? So another barrier to accepting services is that lack of representation. When I walk through your doors, do I see someone that looks like me? Right? That's a huge problem and a big barrier because depending on the marginalized identity that you're servicing, they need to see someone that looks like them. If they walk through your doors and they don't see anyone that looks like them, what is the likelihood that they're going to stay? Another barrier is economic disparities, right? I can't afford to get help. I'm not even earning a livable wage, right? We see that a lot, especially in communities of color, those with different various immigration status, right? If you're undocumented, you're probably not earning a livable wage. That's a huge barrier. Institutional barriers, right? Does the institution that I'm walking in to get help, do they have proper procedures, right? What are their policies saying? This is important, right? Because again, it's going to keep them from actually getting help. Language barriers. It's another big barrier. If I am Spanish speaking, right? And I walk into your services to get help, is there someone there that speaks Spanish? These things make or break somebody's opportunity to get help. Stereotypes and misconception, again, people's personal biases, people's personal preconceived notions, stereotypes, all of those things keep people from accepting services. And then lack of trauma-informed care. Does your staff understand what it really means to be trauma-informed? Because again, these barriers, as well as accessing services, all of that combined keeps a survivor in a marginalized identity from getting the help that they deserve. So now let's talk a little bit about moving forward, right? We know the old way of doing things does not work, right? And so it's going to be important that we talk about a new way of doing things, okay? And so we're going to get into that. So let's talk a little bit about the socio-ecological model, right? And so the socio-ecological model is designed to help you look at all our levels of influence, right? So from an individual level to an interpersonal level, organizational level, community, and public policy, right? And so in these levels of influence, we can find discrimination, oppression, and microaggressions that are experienced on all of these levels, right? So again, as you're reflecting on the work that you're doing and how we can make the work that we do more inclusive to people of all identities, I want you to consider each level of this model, right? Because many times we get stuck in the individual levels or maybe even the interpersonal levels. But really, in order to work to make true structural changes to systematic oppression, we got to look beyond the first two levels, right? It's not just an individual thing. It's not just an interpersonal thing. It's how are we structuring our organizations? What is the messaging in our community? And then public policy, what policies, what laws are we putting in place, right? All of these levels combined is how we're going to make true change to systematic oppression. So let's take a look at each level. So on an individual level, what we're looking at is one's knowledge, attitude, and skills, right? So again, when you're working with someone with a marginalized identity, do you have knowledge around their community, right? Just basic knowledge of their community. What is your attitude towards this type of community, right? What are the skills that you have, right, when working with this person? So some examples to keep in mind from an individual standpoint is that when you're working with someone, avoid assumptions, right? Don't assume that you know their orientation. Don't assume that you know their gender identity. Avoid assumptions, right? And by doing so, it will help you to become more aware of implicit bias, right? Because oftentimes we just assume people's identities, right? Versus asking them. And so we want to do our best on an individual level to not assume, to not make assumptions based on their identity, to not make assumptions about a certain group of people and their community, right? And so we want to make sure that we're not assuming when we're working with individuals. From an interpersonal standpoint, excuse me, the other thing I want you to keep in mind real quick when it comes to individuals is to focus on the trauma, right? So when you're working with someone, focus on their trauma, not their identity, right? But also we want to validate their identity, right? So again, this is what's going to allow them to become more vulnerable and more cooperative, right? The other thing you want to do on an individual level is you kind of want to avoid asking personal questions unless you actually need that information, right? So if it's not information that's pertinent to their help, don't ask, right? Again, we're focusing on their trauma and their healing, right? The other thing you want to do too is you want to ask what information is okay to share, right? So one of the things that we typically do wrong is that we'll gather information about the person that we're servicing, and then we automatically want to start sharing it with the people that we work with. It's always best to just ask them, like, hey, what are you okay with me sharing? What are you okay with me not sharing? Again, this is how we begin to cultivate spaces where someone feels comfortable enough to begin to open up. And then the other thing you want to do too is you want to use simple language. I always say use the language of the survivor, right? So if a survivor identify or that person identifies as a survivor, call them a survivor. If they identify as a victim, call them a victim. But use whatever language they're using when working with them, okay? And then the other thing to keep in mind from an individual standpoint is that you want to understand when the survivor's response is different than yours, right? Because a lot of times in the work that we do, right, we might have an emotional response to what that person is going through. So it's going to be important to know the difference between when it's you and when it's them, right? So that's individual. From an interpersonal level, we're looking at our social networks, right? So some examples is think about what you're reading and watching and listening to, right? Right? Are you reading and watching things that help you to gather an understanding of marginalized identities, right? And what they're going through. For those who work on campuses, are you involved in your campus community? Are you going to different events, right? Or community events outside of your campus so that you can get an understanding of the community in which you serve, right? And even those that use social media, right? Are you using it as a way to really understand and hear the narratives from marginalized populations that you might not get from mainstream media, right? So From an interpersonal standpoint, it's about, again, increasing your knowledge of the communities in which you serve. From an organizational standpoint, we're looking at the environment, we're looking at the ethos, and we're looking at social institutions, right? So some of the things that we're looking at is, do you have a way to communicate with anyone that walks in? Remember, we were talking about one of the barriers is language barriers. So when someone comes into your organization, are you already set up? Do you have interpreters, right? Do you have ASL available, right? Do you have those resources for people who may speak various languages or need ASL or need Braille? Do you have those things in place from an organizational standpoint? The other thing from an organizational standpoint is gathering data, right? Are you learning about the communities in which you're serving, right? Do you know what it is that you need to know about who you serve, but also nationally, right? Like, do you have the data that you're looking that gives you the insight that you need to make sure that your organization properly can serve them? The other thing you want to look at is, who are you hiring, right? We talked about one of the barriers being representation, right? So the thing that we have to look at from an organizational standpoint is, who are we hiring? And the key to this is making sure that we hire people based on inclusion and not diversity, right? I always tell people diversity is like a checkbox. Oh, I hired this Asian person, check, right? But inclusion says, I hired this person that has the work ethic, the knowledge, the experience, and they just so happen to be Asian, right? So from an organizational standpoint, look at who you're hiring. You also want to look at your paperwork and your policies, right? So for example, on your paperwork and your policies, do you have a space for an individual to identify their pronouns, right? Or again, is it just they have to be a male or a female, right? Because again, these things also play a role in why oppression continues to exist and why people don't get access to the services they need, right? And the other thing you want to do from an organizational standpoint is be clear about the limitations in your organization, right? So be very clear about what it is that you can and cannot do, right? Make sure that your policies are inclusive, your training staff that's inclusive. All of those things are going to be important when it comes to your organization, right? Make sure your organizational statement is inclusive and supportive, right? And also make sure that your policies and procedures name the different identities in which you service, right? The other thing you want to think about organizational wise is the physical space, right? So do you have the type of space that is accessible for people with disabilities, whether that's a sensory disability or someone who has to use a wheelchair and may not be able to walk, right? Those things keep in mind from an organizational standpoint. Your website, you want to make sure that it's a universal design, that it's large fonts, that it's user friendly. Those things play a role in organization as well. And then also, do you have text options, right? Or TTY, right? For your hotlines? Because again, depending on the community in which you're servicing, they might need that. If you're servicing someone that's deaf and hard of hearing, they're going to need that way to be able to communicate, right? So you want to keep those things in mind. Then we have community. And so community is basically just looking at cultural values, norms, relationships between organizations, right? So some examples is, how are you collaborating with other organizations? How are you building relationships? Are you doing outreach with different communities in different spaces, right? Are there transportation options to your office, right? Again, if someone is needing to get access to services that you provide and you might be in a rural community, how are they able to get to you, right? Are you working with your local officials? All of that plays a role as well when it comes to anti-oppression and anti-sexual violence work. And then the last part of this model is public policy, state laws, local laws, and regulations. And so some examples is making sure that we vote. We are in an election year, y'all. Make sure that we get out and vote, not just nationally, not just for the present, president, but locally, right? Are we advocating for positive legislation? Are we working with student government if we work on college campuses? Are we building those relationships with those who are called to represent us? All of those are a part of the socio-ecological model. So now let's talk a little bit about equity versus equality, right? So if you look at the picture, right, this image shows the comparison between equality versus equity, right? So equality shows four people with the same exact bike, right? They all have the same bike, which means they have been treated equally and that they have the same resources. The problem with equality is that it's not accommodating, right? It's not accommodating to their individual needs. If you notice, we have someone that's in a wheelchair. So obviously they cannot have the same exact bike, right? Because their needs are different. But with equity, it shows the same folks on different bikes, right? So this means that they're not given the same exact resources. They're given a bike based on their needs, right? And so the thing that you want to understand about equity versus equality is that people are not one size fit all, right? So what works for one person may not work for everybody else. And so you want to keep those things in mind, right? We want to think about that just because this may have been the way it's done for years doesn't mean that it works, right? One of the things that we have to get away from is this notion of if it's not broke, don't fix it. Sometimes we got to fix the thing, even if it's not broke, right? And so equality, again, is treating others how we want to be treated, whereas equity is treating others how they want to be treated. So for the last time, I want you to share with me some of the strategies and some of the things that you're going to take away after today's training. What are some of the things that you have learned that you're like, you know what? I think I want to take that away or work on after going through today's training. And you can just drop them in the chat. I'll give you all a few minutes. Yep. Making sure people understand their biases. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Because it's important. It plays a role in the work that we're doing. So we want to definitely make sure, have an open mind when working with survivors. They are the experts, absolutely. Putting more thought into interactions. That's a good one. Because again, how we interact with someone can determine whether they show up and get our help. Focus on the trauma, not the identity. Yes. Because that's what we're called to do. Help them navigate their trauma. The identity piece is just a complex part of how and when or what type of help they're going to want. So we stay focused on the trauma, we can help them. Any others? Avoid predetermined labels, yes. Ensure leadership and supervisors know how to respond. Know each person is different and know our differences. Yes, these are good. I love it. I love it. I love it. Well, this concludes today's training. Here's my contact information. Feel free to email me at elfornia@mcasa.org. It has been a pleasure to serve each and every one of you. And so I will pass it back over to you, Alyssa.
Thank you. I would now like to direct everyone's attention to the chat where I posted the anonymous evaluation link. We greatly appreciate all feedback as we are constantly striving to improve. Additionally, if you're seeking a certificate of attendance or a certificate for CEU credits, you must complete the evaluation form. Upon submitting the evaluation form, you'll see a box at the top of your webpage containing a link. And if you click on that link, you'll be able to access the CEU request form. If you have any questions, feel free to email me about that. I'll be sending out a follow-up email later today with a copy of today's recording and the PowerPoint slides used in today's presentation, as well as the evaluation link. Thank you again for coming, and we hope to see you tomorrow.